Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining us and for joining this webinar jointly organized by the Global Investigative Journalism Network and the African Investigative Journalism Conference. The topic today is investigating the police, reporting tips and tools. I first want to extend a warm welcome to our colleagues at the AIJC and to those all over the world who have joined us today. Thank you for being with us. My name is Hannane Ferdjani, and I will be facilitating the conversation and the presentations today. I am a journalist myself with experience as a TV reporter, presenter, and producer, in Africa, but also in Europe. And I'm also the founder of Beyond the Noise, a weekly online news program aimed at providing reliable and relevant information to an African audience and combating misinformation. It's my pleasure to be in the presence of so many of my peers and to address a theme that is so important and timely. As we've seen in the last years and increasingly so in the last few months, anti-police brutality and abuse of power movements have sprouted across the world, from the US to Russia to Belarus to Zimbabwe, and as we are seeing now unfold before our eyes in Nigeria with the Ansars movement. Police and security forces are supposed to uphold the law and protect citizens from violence. However, all too often, they themselves are corrupt and violent, even in countries that claim to be democratic. Investigating cases of official misconduct and corruption or violence and challenging official narratives stand at the heart of investigative journalism. And in this webinar, we bring together 4 experienced journalists, 2 from the African continent and 2 from outside of the continent, who have investigated law enforcement. They will share their experience and reporting techniques, ranging from freedom of information searches to source development to visual forensic methods. Thank you again for being with us. Welcome again. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. I am delighted and honored to be joined by 4 journalists with extensive experience analyzing and investigating the police and security forces. First, we have with us Daneel Knoetze. He is the founder and editor of Viewfinder, an accountability journalism nonprofit in South Africa. His reporting focuses on police criminality and the failure, of police oversight mechanisms in South Africa. Thank you for being with us, Daneel. We also have Amal El-Mekki, who's from Tunisia. She's a freelance journalist focusing on human rights and has worked with Tunisian media, including Intifada, but also international outlets such as The Guardian. Her investigation, S-17 Victims of the Ministry of Interior's Whim, but revealed how the Interior Minister of Tunisia basically had illegal border practices and prevented thousands of Tunisians from traveling abroad. Thank you also, Amal, for being with us. We have a team of 2 journalists from the New York Times, Haley Willis, who is a visual investigations reporter with the New York Times video team, where she combines traditional reporting with more advanced forensic methods, digital forensic. Prior to joining the Times, she worked as an open source researcher with the Human Rights Center at the University of California at Berkeley. We also have Malachy Browne, who is a senior story producer on the visual investigations team at the New York Times, where he recently conducted a series of investigations on race and policing. He was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2020 for international reporting for coverage of Russian culpability in crimes around the world, including the bombing of hospitals in Syria. So before we start, a little bit of information about the Global Investigative Journalism Network. GIJN, as you may know, is the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations with 184 member organizations in 77 countries. And it works with journalists everywhere in nonprofits, commercial organizations, and with freelancers. It has an extensive range of resources and tip sheets to help journalists worldwide, and recently published a very helpful piece related to today's webinar, actually, on the forensic methods a reporter are using to reveal attacks by security forces. We urge you to go ahead and check out this tip sheet. That can be very helpful. We'll put the link in the chat box now. You can also check the other resources available on GIJN's website, that is GIJN.org. Now, the Africa Investigative Journalism Conference, as many of you know, is Africa's premier investigative journalism conference. This year, it's been running virtually for obvious reasons since October 6th, but you can still catch useful events and fantastic talks there as it continues till the 30th of this month, October. We also want to hear from you in the audience, so please send any written questions and messages in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have allocated for the event. You can start asking questions right now, and you can do so in any language, as your questions will also be translated. When the speakers will be finished with their presentation and when we'll be done with that part of the event, GIJN Africa editor Benon Oluka will join us on screen to moderate your questions. Finally, please note that we will be recording this session for posting later on YouTube. So without further ado, let's begin. And I first will welcome Daneel Knoetze to begin and share with us his reporting techniques and some of the stories that he's worked on recently.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. I'm Daneel Knoetze. I'm a reporter based at a nonprofit in South Africa, as was mentioned, called Viewfinder. And our flagship project really is an investigation of police criminality and abuse in South Africa. And let me just share my screen. Yeah, and so today I'd like to, first of all, just acknowledge what's happening in Nigeria and say what an apt and terrible background to this presentation and to this panel it is, and to just express solidarity with activists, but also with journalists there. In South Africa, I think, you know, what really motivated, today I'd like to share really just what motivated my initial investigation and questioning of this issue, and what tips I took from other reporters, but also through my experience of looking at this issue in South Africa, that really galvanized the investigation forward, and that I'd like to share outwards to people looking not only at state security or police abuses, but perhaps other abuses of power and accountability failures and shortfalls in their countries. So to bringing me to what kind of like prompted this first investigation, I was a journalist, and I was a news reporter, and I was really actively involved from 2012 onwards, when the Marikana massacre happened in South Africa, which is when 34 mine workers were shot and killed by police, around the reproduction of the portrayal of police brutality in the news media and in the public discourse. And something that I picked up from that experience was that there was a tendency for these cases to be portrayed in isolation. What we're looking at here is a seminal case, or one of the really emblematic ones is the 2011 killing of a protester called Hannane by police. And while I kind of recognize the importance of bringing these incidents to the fore and recording them as this one was done, and broadcasting them, there was a sense that the isolation of each individual event forewent an opportunity for us to see it in a continuum. And I think it played into the narrative of the police management in this country to isolate these events as being down to a few bad apple officers and acting out of line, out of sync with organizational culture, and that there wasn't really a systems failure like underpinning what we were seeing. And so to me, that really just spoke to a failure of accountability through the criminal justice system. So two things, I think, and my first tip then really would be to interrogate how a public interest issue or an abuse of power is portrayed and who benefits from that potentially. And I think the first kind of question I brought to this investigation was what was missing from this portrayal. And I think the first thing that was obvious was a sense of scale, severity, and frequency that certainly was not being presented, and also a sense of systems failure. Now, the former might be easier to try and establish. The latter is really what the bulk of my investigation was about. And so the second tip, I think, that I took away from other reporters was to look and to try and to locate records or data on the topic that you're looking into. A veteran of the African Investigative Journalism Conference, whose seminar I joined a couple of years ago, Ron Nixon from the Associated Press, told us to always assume that the records are being kept. And in the South African context, records are centrally located of police misconduct, and that is done by our police watchdog, the IPID. And these records are published, but very rarely are they actually elevated in the public imagination, public discourse of this issue. What you're looking at is a table form, and this is how we've chosen to represent it, just to show the sheer scale of abuse and brutality. I mean, we've got killings happening on average every day in South Africa, and thousands of torture cases and assault cases that get reported annually. What you see there is the sliver as well, which that data kind of like alluded to, was the failure of the accountability. And that really, so those were, that was the conviction rate, the blue sliver that you'll see coming up now. And that really spoke to, alluded to a systems failure, something that was going terribly wrong in between these cases being taken in and these cases, very few of them ultimately resulting in criminal prosecutions. This is a breakaway slide. I just wanted to share this as well. Investigative data reporter once told me, if you see a table like I showed earlier, you've got to assume that there's a really rich, nuanced database behind it. And that was one of the most amazing things that anyone's ever, or tips that anyone's ever given me, because it led me to work contacts in the police investigative directorate and to gain access to their source data, which really started speaking to the systems failure that I was looking at unpacking before. So this brings me to what the bulk of our investigation was really about, and that was establishing what goes wrong in between this huge intake of police brutality and criminality cases and this very, very small rate of conviction and accountability for individual offenders. And my approach here was also something that I borrowed from another investigative journalist, was comparing really what should happen. And this sounds really simple, but it can get really complicated. What should happen? And in institutions like the police and the criminal justice system, what should happen is really very well defined by things like legislation, procedures, regulations, standing orders, national instructions that present a really clear map for how optimally a system around accountability and police conduct improvement should function. And then there's what happens on the ground. And for that, it was really important for me to develop sources and for me to really inhabit the institutions that constitute the police accountability mechanism and oversight mechanism in South Africa, specifically the police watchdog. And that, I guess my next tip would be that establishing, when there is a systems failure, there are always people in those institutions ready to speak, ready. They don't see themselves necessarily as whistleblowers. They see themselves as frustrated, almost as victims of the systems that they are upholding themselves through whitewashing, through the cover-ups, through their participation in these oversight failures. And that really was what the bulk of our investigation was about, was looking at the police watchdog in particular, but the other institutions that it interacted with, and identifying and inhabiting really the roles of the investigators that are overwhelmed, but also often subject to manipulation of their cases, of their statistics, of their performance, of the case management, and then interpreting that overall macro systems failure to what it means for an individual family. And so it isn't necessarily just always looking at what should happen at a high level for us. It is about taking an individual case and comparing what happened, which is a death in custody, to how that should have been met in an investigative way through the procedures, that outline best practice and what actually happened. And in this case, we established through looking at the docket and comparing it to what happened, and the docket we accessed on behalf of the family. You know, it's really important to build your relationships, I guess, with the victims and the people that are individually prejudiced by these systems failures, and to provide a service through your journalism as well to them individually and as a collective. And we established that, you know, from the onset, the police watchdog actually didn't investigate this case, that none of not even the scene was attended, that was done by police officers themselves, which is a flagrant kind of non-compliance with the procedure that should happen in this scenario. But another important aspect of it for us was to take the individual case and to try and extrapolate it upwards to what it means in terms of the systems failure as a whole. And in this case, from the COVID-19 lockdown, the first death attributed to police action during that time in South Africa on the 27th of March, we established that the police watchdog used an autopsy finding of a natural causes death due to a heart attack as a way to close a case, when it's common cause, I guess, amongst pathologists that a heart attack can be induced by the stress of torture and assault that almost certainly was suffered by this victim. His name was Petrus Michels. And so closing out, just moving to the end of the presentation to keep it within the 10 minutes, what was the hope for impact of this, of establishing these systems failures, the scale, the severity of the issue, and representing it through investigative reporting and writing? I think the first thing was to reframe, or at least to have a different basis for the narrative around police brutality in South Africa, to inform civil society activism, to imbue it with the sense that there was definitely a failure within the institutions, that this is not down to a few individual officers acting out of line, and that those failures could be rectified through reforms and through reckoning with them and through exposure. The second was to just improve exactly those investigative systems and how specifically within the police watchdog performance is managed, measured, and how investigations are prioritized as opposed to just pushed through the case management system to generate performance statistics. And ultimately the hope, of course, is to improve accountability and to see a higher, to see an improvement in the rates of convictions and in the rates of police conduct improving, and police management taking responsibility therefore. I'm sure we'll have time to discuss more in the question and answer session, but for now I'll hand over to Hannane. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, Daneel, for this thorough and thoughtful presentation. You mentioned right at the conclusion, in your conclusion, that the hope for impact was also to be able to improve methods within the systems of police forces. I know it's probably a little bit early to say and to measure that kind of impact that can come from the kind of reporting that you've done, but I'm interested in the feedback that you've gotten from publishing such stories, and not just from the police forces themselves, namely.
So yes, you know, looking at the data and looking at the systems failure, unfortunately, I got stuck on the police watchdog and the oversight mechanism, because there was just, that is the first responder to the scene of a police shooting or murder. And there was just such fundamental flaws that happened at that original moment of investigation that the subject of my original investigation was actually the police watchdog. And what I established and uncovered was that these cases were being pushed through the case management system purely to inflate performance statistics through closures and completions. And that was really, and without really measuring the impact that this was having on actual accountability. So that low conviction ratio was not impacting on their performance. And I think that has really been one of the main findings that we've championed through the first phase of this investigation. I must say that we're focusing now increasingly on systems within the police service, the organizational culture, and the cover-ups that happen within the police themselves. But certainly there was this commitment before the the police watchdog before Parliament of a renewed or a reckoning with how it measures performance and how it manages and prioritizes its cases. And that for us was really an important, I guess, victory and a takeaway that it is possible to see a recognition of an issue that was deeply rooted through the exposure in the media, and for it to be received constructively after a time. At first there was a lot of pushback, but after a period there was a real constructive engagement, and that really has spurred us to continue with this line of work and this approach.
Maybe another question that I think you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, that you also use a lot of the records that were public records to be able to gather the data that you did. I think that for many investigative journalists across the world, it's not always a feasible approach. Some records might be readily available to the public in theory, but it's actually hard to gather the data. I wonder if you can think of other channels, or if you've thought about other channels, a way to bypass such challenges in different
Certainly. So my previous presentation for the Global Investigative Journalism Network focused a lot on my public records kind of engagement with the state and the mechanisms that were available to us in South Africa, which is relatively transparent, I guess, compared to other African countries. But just reflecting on that emphasis and the actual day-to-day of my investigation, it was much more rooted in building relationships with sources, developing sources and conversations, not in a sense to publish what they were saying or to gain access to what they might have access to, but just to, as the word I used earlier was, to inhabit their world, to inhabit the pressures that they are under, and some of the motivations or the perverse incentives that result in cover-ups and pushing cases through to completion without investigating them. And just in closing, when there is a systems failure like the ones that we've established through our investigation, there are always people in those institutions that are willing to speak about being caught up in it. They don't see themselves necessarily as whistleblowers, but they see themselves as aggrieved or reluctant participants in a cover-up, essentially. And they're always willing to speak and to network outwards from your sources to other sources. It was really important for us. And I think that might be possible in even some of the most opaque state environments. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation and for giving us this additional tip, which you had already given, but for elaborating on that, which indeed makes a lot of sense. I think in the most opaque systems, it's always possible to reach out to a whistleblower. We'll now hear from Malachy, who has done most of her work in Tunisia and has investigated the Ministry of Interior's practices and the way that was prevented thousands of Tunisians from traveling abroad. And I will just give you the floor now.
Thank you, Hannane. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. So let me get my screen shared first and pull up the slides. Yeah. So I'm gonna walk you through a case study of investigation I did, and that was related to investigating the police, of course. In this presentation, I'm gonna focus on the context of the story, the main tools that I used, and some tips, of course. I hope that they would be useful. So in 2015, in 2015, after the Bardo and Sousse attack in Tunisia, the Tunisian government declared a war on terror and adopted a series of measures to deal with press and security concerns. However, many of these measures were actually relied on heavy-handed and repressive security tactics. And 5 years later, they remain still in place. Also, the Tunisian authorities initially declared a state of emergency in 15 January 2011 and repeatedly renewed it until March 2014. But these emergency states were reinstated in November 2015, immediately after another terrorist attack, the presidential guard attack in Tunis, and it has been regularly renewed since. In 2013, in an effort to contain the flux of Tunisians joining the so-called Islamic State, the Tunisian Ministry of Interior put into effect a set of measures to monitor the movements of individuals it suspected to be affiliated with the jihadi groups and believed they might attempt to join armed groups in Libya, Iraq, Syria, and control them at the country's borders. So known as this S-17, from the French word signalisation, signaling, and the number of directive, the measures were instituted as part of a national plan to combat terrorism. So here comes the investigation. I'm talking about S-17 victims of the Interior Ministry Mood or WIM, which is a multimedia investigative story published in October 2018 and produced by Arij Network. The story actually revealed the Interior's Ministry use of S-17 that violated people's freedom to travel outside the country and even move in within Tunisian cities. At that time, about 100,000 Tunisian citizens actually were subject to the S-17 border control measure. So here we see Mohammed Dia in a picture taken by his mother, who set fire on himself in front of the police station in September 2018, after suffering for years from being classified as 17 and persecuted by the police. Mohammed Dia was actually one of 11 cases we documented out of 35 cases interviewed. The investigation revealed that this violation of the freedom of movement has been applied to a large number of people who were considered suspect on the basis of religious beliefs or practices, or simply because of their appearance, such as having long beards or wearing religious clothing, or on account of previous convictions, without any evidence being provided that actively links them to armed groups. And the investigation also documented the presence of many journalists and civil society activists among those subject to the border measure, as well as other people who are not religiously observant. There are also others who do not know why they were haven't been placed under the S-17 measure, though they speculate it could be due to their having received legal amnesty in the past, especially after the 2011 revolution. And by delving more deeply into the dark corridors of the S-17 measure, we revealed other forms of bribery, extortion, and harassment by the security forces. Actually, we can see here Hisham, who is a young Tunisian man who paid about 15,000 dinars to officials and employees of the Interior Ministry in order to help him lift the S-17 border control measure, which he had been subject to since 2014 at the time, following a case related to terrorism. and which had prevented him from traveling abroad. So we can see that someone who was in front of the judge for a real terrorist accusation could have left the S-17 just because he gave money to the ministry. And here we can see some of the sources I used to investigate the S-17. So I interviewed 35 citizens, met in 6 different governorates in Tunisia, but only 11 of them were documented, verified victim cases with lawyers, administrative court documents, etc. I also based my work on a whistleblower testimony, the civil society reports, the legal experts, officials, and etc. Also, in the S-17, I made an access to information request. But actually, in the case of that story, the access to information request was made during the investigation, but the decision of the authority to access information and which obliges the ministry to deliver statistics about the use of the S-17 border measure, it was only officially announced after the story was published. That actually helped spread the story further, as more media were interested in tackling the subject and put more pressure on the Interior's ministry. This latter was under pressure, of course, the ministry, and it was forced to acknowledge the violations and take action to stop them. I can mention here that a specific commission within the ministry was created to deal with S-17 cases after the story. So here, if I want to be useful, I would like to give some tips. First of all, in this kind of stories, would like to provide the context. It's really important to show the context of the story, of these violations. As in my case, we were under emergency state, we were on a war on terrorism, we have unstable governments, and we do have corruption, of course, within the government and different administrations. And also regarding the context, actually, you will need to understand the policies and laws that govern the police conduct in your country to know what is inbound and what is not inbound. You also want to see whether the rules are written in line with the best practices followed elsewhere, or if they are just out of the date. The second tip I would like to present here is the fact check. As I said before, in the S-17 story, I interviewed 35, but only could do the fact checking of 11 cases. Where did I do the check? It was in the government reports, in the court documents, and with the help of experts who were actually lawyers and civil society experts. Be specific. Be specific. Also in the same story, I could have talked about the S-19 and the S-18, which both are illegal measures actually taken by the Interior Ministry as well as the S-17. But I preferred to keep focusing on only one measure of them, so that the reader does not really get confused with too much legal and technical information in one piece. When I say don't glorify the police, as I explained in the beginning, Tunisia is under an emergency state in the middle of war on terror, as the government said, of course. So you may, in a similar context, if you are in a similar context, you may hear people where they attack you, or they will just attack you for not glorifying the police or not praising the police achievements in such a tough security situation. But it should go actually without saying that our job as journalists is to make sure that human rights are not violated in the name of fighting extremism and violent extremism, and to hold the police authorities accountable in case of violations. Make FOI, actually the government, every government must have tones of documents that citizens are entitled to, and you should go get them. The Tunisian law, for example, on access to information begins with a presumption that all the records should be open records, or at least should be shared if asked for, with some few exceptions. And my advice is that, especially at the local level, there is a good chance that you might be the first person to gather up a trove of records and analyze them. My last tip here would be about thinking about partnerships, especially with NGOs. For example, on the S17 story, we made a partnership with Amnesty International MENA office, which happened to be preparing a report on S17 itself. So the story uses the report as one of the main sources, and then both our story and Amnesty International report were published on the same day. And this kind of partnership actually helped spread the story further nationally and internationally, and put more pressure on the official body responsible for the violations, here the Interior Ministry. And last but not least, mass media will probably attack you if you are working on this kind of stories, or even ignore you. Then maybe you are in the right way. That's what I believe, because this happened to me with my S17 story, when for weeks the mass media in Tunisia were talking about the S17 and the story, but no one invited me to talk about it. They were only inviting the police and the Interior Ministry, without the person who worked on it. The second thing is that don't be afraid of being accused of bleaching terrorism or disturbing the public tranquility. We have this accusation in Tunisia. So always a good story actually makes controversy. And with that, I will pass it to you, Hannane. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal, for your presentation and for talking us through the story that you've worked on. I also wanted for you to maybe elaborate on one of the last points that you shared, which had to do with not glorifying the police. You did mention being attacked, I guess, to an extent by the government, but also by mass media for reporting on the story. I wonder if you can speak to having particular obstacles coming from the government itself during your investigation, ways that they might have intimidated you into simply stopping your investigations, and how you came about bypassing those challenges or overcoming those challenges.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, in the beginning of the process to get the information from the ministry, I went myself to the Interior Ministry in order to apply for the information needed, the statistics about the S17 cases, and there I was interviewed and questioned for more than 30 minutes from the officials. Why was I working on that story? Should I be worried about talking about presumed terrorists, and to which media outlet was I working on that story? And they even, in the beginning, they even refused to accept the request from me, the written request. They refused to get it. They said, it's a premiere for us. We don't have orders to get this kind of request from journalists or anyone. So they made me wait, and then come another official who was telling me, listen, girl, you are still young, you are in the beginning of your career. Why would you do such a harm to yourself? And it was really funny, because the law at that time to access to information, it was well established. We have an authority, but still officials and people at ministry, they don't know about access to information. They don't know what it is. And then, of course, I filed the law case against the ministry at the higher authority for access to information. But during the shooting of the story itself, I had to travel from city to another. So I shooted with people. I interviewed people in the south of Tunisia, exactly in Mednin, in Ben Guerdine, which is a small village on the borders with Libya, with really tough security situation. And I was interviewing someone who has S17 there. And in the middle of the interview, which was in a small corner of a park, came a policeman, and he stood in the table just in front of us. And the cameraman, who was a local cameraman, actually recognized him. And he told me, "I'm sorry, Amal, I cannot really continue working now because the policeman is intimidating me, and I am the father of some children. So we could not shoot that day." So those were the two basic challenges that I had to face during the establishment of the story. But after that, of course, I had to face accusations of perturbing the tranquility of the government and the tranquility of our police authorities, and even of bleaching terrorism.
Well, thank you so much, Amal, for sharing. And now we're going to give the floor to another young journalist, a young woman who's also used intelligent methods to investigate police brutality, this time in the US. That is Haley Willis from the New York Times. Whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannane, and both of the speakers so far, and for both AIJC and GIJN for having me. I'm going to speak a little bit about, once I share my screen, about how we investigate police conduct at the New York Times, and specifically in our visual investigations team. So it's interesting because actually a lot of the techniques that the two other speakers spoke about are techniques that we use as well. Sourcing, speaking to eyewitnesses, people that have experienced violence, public records requests for things, for example, like body camera footage from police officers. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about other techniques, particularly open source techniques for finding information about police conduct when you run into barriers and some other types of reporting. So the same barriers that Daneel and Amal spoke about. So if a source is intimidated into not speaking with you anymore, if your public records request or your freedom of information request doesn't go through for the many reasons that a lot of us have experienced, what can you do? So these are a few of the policing stories we've done at the Times, and we cover kind of across the world. We've also done stories in Puerto Rico, Chile, Belarus, and have monitored across the world, Iran, Iraq, and of course, most recently, the NSARS movement in Nigeria. So hopefully kind of the practical tips I give you today will be applicable across a lot of contexts. I'm gonna first talk about just how to, what we call discovery in the open source world. So how do you find openly available evidence, or evidence that you can source without going through these more official channels? So one of the most openly available platforms available to journalists today is social media, right? So I think we've all seen, essentially since the Arab Spring, how social media platforms have become a major way that people get out information about police conduct. And especially with all the protests going on recently, we've seen that. So I think there's two main parts to finding evidence of policing on social media. One is knowing what platforms to look on and the context you're looking at, and then knowing how to best search those platforms. So for example, we did a lot of reporting on policing in Hong Kong during the Hong Kong protests. Knowing where people are actively sharing evidence in the Hong Kong context is extremely important. So what you see on my screen right now, these platforms are Telegram and a platform called LIHKG, which is kind of like a online messaging forum that's used specifically in Hong Kong. So knowing what the platforms are where people are sharing this based on what you're reporting on, and then, like I said, knowing how to search those. So for example, with Telegram, it's very popular in Hong Kong. It's also very popular in Syria. How do you best then search that platform knowing that people are sharing, for example, videos of police misconduct there? There's a really great tool that's been developed called Telegago. This is an open source tool developed by someone put on the internet that you can search a search term. So the search term you see in the box here is the Chinese characters for Hong Kong police force. So that's another tip, is of course, when you're searching for this material, searching in the language of the country that you're looking at. And then it'll basically work almost as like a Google search, but specifically for Telegram. So this popped up every single Telegram channel where recently the phrase Hong Kong police force has been used. And then you can start clicking through these channels and looking for the evidence that you might be in the market for, essentially. So what videos are out there? What visual evidence are people sharing? Are people filming from their phones and putting out there that can give you a broader look at what's happening? Another major thing in Hong Kong that was happening at the time was a lot of people were live streaming. And if you're really kind of embedded in these communities on Telegram, on these platforms, and you know where people are, you find links and you find databases where essentially people were aggregating all of the live streams that were happening at once. So you could sit at your computer, you could watch 9 perspectives of the same incident in real time as it's happening. And that's an extremely important tool for journalists for speed and for bringing accountability of seeing it happening in the moment. Another example of this is work that we've been doing on policing in the US. We've seen how this has kind of blown up in the past month since May, when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. Twitter is an extremely popular platform everywhere. And it's also where a lot of evidence of policing in the US gets shared. So again, we know it's on Twitter, but how do we find it? What's the best way to search it? This is just one example. It looks like a bunch of gobbledygook, but once you kind of understand the best ways to search these platforms, it can be really helpful. So essentially what you see in my search bar up here is the word geocode : and those numbers that you see are the coordinates of the location where we know George Floyd was killed. So the grocery store in Minneapolis where he was killed. 1 mile, that's telling essentially Twitter, can you search for anyone who posted a tweet within 1 mile of those coordinates? So I want to see any video from that day or days afterward where someone posted a tweet, a video, a photo within 1 mile of the location where George Floyd was killed. And then I add the search term police. So people speaking about, police conduct against George Floyd, and also in the days after protests that sprouted up after his death. So again, that's a very kind of practical way to search these platforms to get down to the information you want, because there's such a massive information, and how do you narrow that down? So like I said before, obviously a major part of reporting on policing, as the other 2 speakers spoke about, is eyewitnesses and victims and people that this happens to. And there's a lot of ways to find eyewitnesses, and several of them the other speakers already covered, but for us, something that we found really useful is, again, like using these platforms to our advantage. So putting out call outs to people on Twitter, on Telegram, providing a safe and secure and anonymous way for them to send us tips of, has this happened to you? Do you have any videos? Have you seen this happening to other people? And using social media and using the power of crowdsourcing to get the information that you need. And essentially what happened with this man that I showed you before is we knew about his case. We had about 5 videos of exactly what happened to him. And we didn't actually know who he was, because sometimes when videos are floating around in the Twitter sphere, they're out of context. How do you place those? How do you speak to the person so you can do the kind of fact checking that we're all talking about? That came through these call outs of people saying, like, I know this man, or like, that's this person. Here's 2 more videos that we have of that incident. And bringing that all together, we got hundreds and hundreds of tips from people because we provided this crowdsourced but also secure way for them to share that information with us. Another part of kind of obviously visually investigating these types of incidents is what other visual information might there be that's not as open source, so maybe not filmed by someone and put on Facebook, but something like security camera footage, CCTV footage, right? So this is a very common piece of evidence that we use in our reporting, but how do you get it, of course, is a major question. Sometimes it's a very simple process, and of course, this is also context dependent. There are security concerns with this. You have to, think in each case whether this is the right thing to do. But in the case of George Floyd, what we did is we went to Google Maps, we went to the grocery store where he was killed, and we called up every single building within that block radius and just asked them, do you have security camera footage running outside of your building that may have captured this incident, and can you share it with us? And that's how we got this security footage, which ended up being a major part of the investigation and put a lot of pieces to the puzzle of what happened. And then one last piece of open source evidence that I think a lot of people don't realize is open source. And again, what I'm about to show you is US specific context, but is, how do we get into the minds of police officers? That's a very hard thing to do. There's whistleblowers, there's officers that will speak to you, but sometimes getting to, that culpability and accountability can be quite difficult. Something that we've found to get around that in the US is that a lot of radio communications between officers are actually publicly available if you know where to look. So communications between dispatch and emergency services, police, 911, fire, also communications between police officers on the ground and incident command. So what they're saying to each other in the moment that these things are happening. So there's two main platforms that we use for this. The first is called Broadcastify. Broadcastify is essentially a platform that aggregates scanner audio from counties across the US. You can go to the specific county and you can get specific feeds from the day, from the time that an incident happened. So I know George Floyd was killed on May 25th around 8 p.m. I know that because I got that CCTV footage, which has timestamps, which gives me that information. I can use that to then go to this site and pull the feed archives of emergency services conversations during that incident. Another platform is called Open Megahertz. This one is particularly interesting because you can hear the conversations in real time. If you go to this website and you go to a city, you can see the audio files populating second by second as they're happening. And this is especially useful if you're monitoring a policing situation that's currently ongoing. So for example, after George Floyd was killed, when all of the protests were happening, we use this to monitor the police movements as they were actually policing the protests. Okay, so once you have the evidence and those variety of methods, how do you actually organize it? Malachy is going to talk a bit more about how you actually analyze all of that and put it together. But just on a very simple level, we found the best way to do this is timelining. So putting all of your information on a timeline can reveal a lot about what happened and for accountability. So in the case of George Floyd, everyone had seen this video. I'm sure many of you have seen it. And a lot of people felt like they knew the full story because of this one video. But when you put all of those other details together, the CCTV, the scanner audio, it tells a much more honestly damning story of what happened, and that's extremely important for accountability. So this is a very small snippet of the timeline that we created for this piece. And when you put all of these details together, so you have each source, you have exactly moments what happened in each source, so timelining out what happened in each video, each piece of scanner audio, what time did it happen, it reveals a lot of details. So just one example of that is, we know that at 8:21 from scanner audio, we know that police increased the call for George Floyd's EMS response to emergency. So they knew it was a medical emergency at 8:21 based on conversations with dispatch. And yet from the CCTV footage, we know that the officer did not lift his knee from George Floyd's neck until 7 minutes after that. So putting those details together tells a quite specific story of what the officers knew in the moment and the choices that they made after that. I'll stop there for time, but thank you.
And I will now let Malachy Browne also add on to what Haley Willis has been saying in her presentation.
Thanks, Hannane. And I'll just share quickly my screen and go through some of these examples that I have. I'm going to show a presentation about sort of how we, a little bit more on how we organize, you know, this content and analyze it once we collect it. Can you guys see my screen there? Yeah, cool. But I just wanted to do something very quickly, which is like a quick, another little tip for monitoring these stories in a free way. So, you know, if you wanted to monitor the NSARS protests and response in Nigeria, you know, what you might do is go to Google and search within Twitter, all users is that asterisk, and just for their lists, and look for maybe anybody who's created an NSARS list. Nobody has, but if I go to Nigeria, Twitter lists are great, by the way. You know, they allow you to organize people and kind of create a ticker tape of what's going on in a certain country or situation or theme. You know, but if I do Nigeria, there's loads of people who have Nigeria lists, and there's a very quick way to merge those into a list of your own. So if I go to my lists and I create a new list and I call it Nigeria, and I say monitoring NSARS, I hit next, and I've got this list. And then if you go to Google and you search Twitter list copy, there's this Twitter list copy tool. Go in there, sign in with Twitter. Now I'm going to find somebody who's got a list. Barnaby Phillips has got a Nigeria list. I know he's a journalist, so I'm going to get it. I might get Ruth McLean's list. People I recognize who probably have high quality lists. I'll put Barnaby's list in there, get his lists. He's got Ivory Coast, he's got all these other ones. I want Nigeria. I'm going to, from all of my lists, I'm going to choose Nigeria and I go copy. And then it's working. And there's 108 people. Now if I go Ruth McLean, get her lists. Oh, it is Lean McLean. Get the name right. She's got all these other lists. If I get Nigeria, copy that into my Nigeria. It won't duplicate people, but if I go back to my Nigeria list, suddenly, ooh, just refresh that and see what members I've got. I suddenly have a list on my account with two of those lists together with 131 people, and I can monitor, and you can keep building that, or you can knock people off it and all the rest of it. A second way to monitor it, if you've got access or funding to this, or maybe a foundation who would support getting access to this, is a tool that we often use called SAM Desk, Social Asset Management Desk. And you can put in a hashtag or a search term. You can put up 5 or 6 of them here. And you can just filter for videos, or you can filter for pictures or text, and it'll search across Twitter, YouTube, and Snapchat all at once. And it allows you to see all of these videos. Open one up. You can add in some notes. You can play it. You can get the link to download the video. You can put in some notes on it. You can also add it to a collection, right? So you can say, I've got all these different collections for Trump and COVID, for cops and militias, for Louisville, wildfires, different stories that we're monitoring. I'm going to say, put it into my collection for NSARS, because that's something I'm interested in. You have all these results, and you can quickly add them in if you like, and then your collection looks like this, and you've got all of these different assets in there that allow you to organize it and start examining them and verifying them. So this is a good tool. And then another one is Data Miner, which we often use. Data Miner gives you breaking news alerts, but you can also do a geographic search area, and it has the intelligence to understand where it thinks people are located, if they're reporting anything related to NSARS. And so these are just some of the tools that we'll often use. Obviously TweetDeck as well, if you have lists and hashtags, and you can put in different searches. So there's free tools and there's paid tools. Just to give you a sense of those. And then one other tip is Invid is a free Chrome extension, and it has some analysis and search capabilities, and a better search of Twitter than Twitter even has itself, because you can search down to the minute of a tweet. So if you know something happened in a very short time frame, often what we try to do is get closer to the story, get closer to the source, find eyewitnesses like Haley is talking about, and then turn these open sources into primary sources, try to get them into secure chats where you can speak to them securely and talk to them that way. And just one other tip is that, two other tips. If there's a police department or another source who regularly uploads videos, one of the stories that I will show you is an investigation into a shooting in Louisville. And I could see from the YouTube channel that that police department, often they publish security footage, body cam footage. So what I did was I just subscribed to that channel and turn on alerts so that I'll get a ping. Anytime there's a new video, I'll get an alert. And it's kind of like doorstepping that YouTube account. So you get you're first to see it when it arrives in your inbox. And then one other tip is that sometimes we want to search YouTube, but the search isn't great on YouTube. So if you're looking for historic videos, you can, again, use the Google command cite youtube.com and say I'm looking for NSARS. You get all these videos in NSARS, but if you hit tools, you can go back and customize the date range. And so you can go back in time and it'll give you only videos for those 2 days. Hit go and you get different search results. And so these are just some free and open ways to search and to collect what we think of as evidence, and testimony and sources and witnesses. Now I'll just go to, again, how we think about, once we get that material, organizing it and analyzing it. So that's the second part of the reporting. And one case is the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia in February of this year. Now, it wasn't by the police, but it was by somebody who had a relationship with police, wasn't arrested at the scene, and was only charged with murder after video emerged of this shooting. And what we wanted to do was pair all of this evidence together. So there's CCTV footage of Ahmaud when he arrives into the neighborhood, and then there's mobile phone footage of him running down the street and being shot. And that's all that was out there, and it polarized the debate, or the news reportage and the discussion about this shooting. But what I wanted to do was, when I saw this footage, this is often what we'll do, is we'll just start very roughly map out in time, map out in space how things unfold, step by step, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and suddenly we see him running that direction. And the next time we see him running this direction. And so the question is, well, what happened in between? How long was he running for? Who are these guys, and why did they start chasing him? And when did they start chasing him? And so again, with the 911 calls, when we got the audio files from the police, they contained this timestamp and a timestamp in the second call. And what we could see in the two videos, there were only 2 911 calls made, and this guy in one video makes one, and this guy in the second video makes one. And we know that because in this video, he makes the first call. You can see him picking up his phone when it starts, and at exactly 2 minutes, 11 seconds later, he puts his phone down. So you're looking at the details in the video and comparing it with the length of time of the call and what he's describing in the audio and the telephone call. You can see it in the video. And this one, you can see he's holding a phone to his ear, and he's describing, what he's seeing: black male running down the road. And we could see from the police reports also the number that this phone was made, this call was made from, and it was this gentleman's son, because we got his name, and his son actually shoots Ahmaud Arbery. So all of these details allow us to sort of stitch these videos together in time, and then by looking at looking more forensically at the audio, you can hear the first gunshot in the 911 call, and you can hear it also in the 911 call and the cell phone video. And by linking up. There were 3 gunshots, and there was also the father called out his son's name in the middle. And so you're looking very closely at the audio waveform there just to double verify it. And then looking at police records and getting more details. And as Haley showed you, we often use spreadsheets to map out the times that these things are happening. So the security camera time might be off by an hour, as it was in this case. The 911 text reports are off by a couple of minutes because the dispatcher is typing in, but the 911 calls themselves log the actual second. So we synchronized it all up with the 911 system, call system, and we calculated the minutes and showed what happened minute by minute, second by second, if we could. Where there was no cell phone footage, then we looked through the police reports to try to reconstruct what happened, that they chased him down one road, then they chased him down another road. There was the guy, this is the fellow who filmed the video, and we listened to his testimony, and we were able to stitch it all together. And he was, after our report came out, then he was arrested and charged with second degree murder as well. And often in producing our pieces, we will use mapping to sort of lay it all out and explain what's happening. These are the 2 cars that are chasing Arbery, and then you kind of use these graphics to call it out. A second technique that we often use, I'll just do this very quickly, is the killing of David McAtee in Louisville. There was security camera footage inside his barbecue shop. This is just outside his barbecue shop. There are his barbecues. As police arrive in the area to sort of clear away the area, and then this is a live stream. So this live stream has been filmed over here by this vehicle, the sports utility vehicle, and all of these security videos were silent. They had no sound, but this had audio, and who shot when was important. And so by synchronizing all of these videos together, we're able to analyze what's going on in different areas and how it all comes together. We do that by really looking at very flashing lights in cars to make sure that they're synced up. When David McAtee, the restaurant owner, is walking out this store and into the alleyway, we're synchronizing up his footsteps. So like really, really precise synchronization. And then, again, using mapping to explain it. This is David McAtee as he's walking out. And we show the police actions and how very quickly they moved across this area and started firing pepper balls into the doorway. And that led to a fatal outcome. And then you examine the police's actions against the guidelines and the rules by which they're supposed to disperse protests. And that's sort of what we do. This is a URL where you can find more of our investigations. And I just show very quickly, these are short investigations that are maybe a week long. This is another one that was almost a year long into door busting, no-knock raids, and how lethal they become. And there's lots of videos there and photographs showing this happening. And I also just wanted to show that a lot of our pieces are video productions, but you can also clip these little videos once you have permission to use them into an article and just put like annotations around what's happening. And that's often very, very effective as well. You can slow it down, just do very light graphics to explain what you're seeing in the videos, go frame by frame through them. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Malachy, for your those tips, very practical ones. I'm sure a lot of us will use in the future. Just in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the Q&A session to give the audience the opportunity to run some questions by you. And I'm going to welcome GIJN's Africa editor, Benon Oluka, to help moderate those.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Hannane. We've got quite a good number of questions. Many of them for Daneel, so you should get ready to respond to quite a number of them. But I'll start with the general ones. Marvin Adams asks, are police officers' employment files a matter of public record? Then the second one is, why aren't police officers drug tested? I will ask Malachy to take that up for starters.
Why police aren't drug tested?
Police officers implement files public record, and why aren't police officers drug tested? Yes.
For me, I don't know if I think they are drug tested in the States, in the US, especially if there's a police involved incident. We're investigating one at the moment, and I know that there was drug testing done on the night in question. Throughout their careers, I expect there is some drug testing done, but I don't know enough about that. FOIA and that sort of stuff, you know, we try that, but often our pieces will rely on video evidence that emerges either on social media, leaked by a business owner, or lawyers of defendants can be very, very helpful as well. And there'll be confidential sources. So that's one way to get to material as well. But FOIA, obviously, if you're thinking about longer term investigations, as Daneel and Amal were talking about, you know, that can be effective. Often, I think it depends on the country, the state, the department. It can be a battle, you know, to really try to get FOIA information, and often it requires picking up sometimes the person who's in charge of releasing FOIA information doesn't understand how to access the data that you want. And if you can understand how their data is organized and how they keep their information, then maybe you can change your FOIA and say, give me a search of these spreadsheets for this particular field or data or whatever, that makes it their job easier, and then they can release it and redact it more effectively. So sometimes there's like just not the same understanding or breakdown in communication, and if you can talk to somebody on the phone about that, that's often a very helpful way to get access.
Okay, thank you. For Daneel, Kumar Menon says he is an editor for special investigations from Midday newspaper in South Africa, in India. He says, how many police officers have been convicted for custodial offenses? That's the first question. And the second, are autopsies of custodial, just a moment, has autopsy of custodial torture been established in any of the cases? Daneel, please.
I don't have the data at hand for how many convictions. What I can say is that there's about between 350 and 450 police killings that happen every year. And outside of that, there's also about 150 to 250 deaths in custody. Certainly, I've looked at cases where deaths in custody have been positively linked to torture, a technique that's often used, and audiences in the US would relate to this too, is a form of dry waterboarding, which is asphyxiation without the use of water. And that has the potential to induce heart attacks and sudden death. I've also, it's often very difficult to establish that in an autopsy. The results may come back to look like a natural cause, like a heart attack. There is, and I think the investigations often take police versions of what happened at face value, and there's, because of a lack of resources, often a very little resource or very little investigative investment in cases where it can't be definitively proven soon, or in many cases it can't be definitively proven. But yeah, something that I think that our investigation has uncovered is the frequency and the prevalence, and I'll be writing on this soon actually, of torture that persists in police custody in South Africa, and also the continuities that torture has with the techniques, the methods, and the intent that was used during political repression and policing during apartheid. And I think it makes a really strong case that there has been a transfer of organizational culture and techniques from an old police force during the apartheid period, which were amalgamated into this new human rights-centric police service in the mid-90s during our transition period. And that is subject to an upcoming, the subject of an upcoming article. So hopefully I can link with the questioner and plug them into my findings around that soon. Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't answer it more clearly.
Okay, thank you. There is a question about what's happening in Nigeria. Akanimo Kufre says, how do we present social media video evidence against military denial as in Nigeria's Lekki massacre experience of 2010? I'll ask Haley to take that. You know, when the military is denying evidence that's available on social media, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and it's something that we actually monitored and looked into when it happened. So I think the best use of social media evidence is when you have, you know, official accounts saying that this didn't happen, because then you can use these visual sources to prove or deny that that's actually the case. So there was a lot of video footage that came out of what happened at the Lekki toll gate. A lot of people were there streaming live on Instagram. There were videos that came out through Twitter, through WhatsApp. So I know people in Nigeria who were sending me things that they were receiving through WhatsApp groups. And a lot of those videos show details that you can use to kind of put to the military account. So for example, there's one video on the side of the toll gate where many of the armed people were standing, and you can very clearly see the military fatigues they're wearing. So do those match the military fatigues of, you know, a specific unit in the Nigerian army? How can we use that evidence to put it against what the Nigerian army is saying? How can we timeline out this information so the exact same methodology that Malachy and I just explained? For example, there was a live stream that was about 5 hours long, leading up to the shooting and after the shooting. So we can timeline that out and see exactly, like, when did the shooting start? Were the protesters being peaceful at the time? There were questions about for things like, for example, the lights, street lights being turned off, CCTV camera being removed. And there's a lot of visuals that you can use to confirm or deny those claims and look into those claims. So when the shooting happens, for example, you can see the street lights are still on, but there's lights above the toll booth that are off. And so all of these questions can be answered using these open sources when you can't really rely on what the military is saying or not.
I can maybe just add to that very briefly if we have time. Just one example was the shooting in Abuja a couple of years, 2 years ago. The military denied it. They said they acted in self-defense, even to us in our interviews. But when you pull this is the moment that the shooting happened, and you could see that they're not acting in self-defense. They actually shoot the leaders of the this religious procession in Abuja as they're coming up to negotiate with the police, who have blockaded their path, their route. And then, by stitching the video to talking to witnesses and stitching the video together, we're able to show what happened. And sorry, some of it is very gruesome, but and then show the aftermath of that and go to the hospitals and talk to people, but also identify the unit that was responsible by looking at the details of the insignia on their uniforms, but also their vehicles, and zooming in on these patches. So there's visual investigations is very much about revealing more than you think is in the video and extracting more reporting out of it. And identifying the presidential guard, the unit responsible, was important for us because the US gives military support to the Nigerian military. And this was actually then the presidential guard, and we looked at the chain of command as well in reporting that out. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now, there is a really good question here, and I think that will act as our last question. So in summary, what are the 2 or 3 most important tools that you can use to monitor police accountability. I would wish that all the speakers respond to this, starting with Amal.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, that's a very important question. I was really amazed at all the presentation made by my colleagues, and I did my story in the traditional way. I moved, I traveled, I met people, I went into the court documents, the government documents. It was all actually traditional, basically. But yeah, of course, you can do it the traditional way by interviewing people, talking to people, listening to them, or even using the social media in getting into groups of the victims, or posts using the passwords, using the Nimokle to find the stories. But actually, yes, since Malachy and Haley, they were presenting using the visual investigations, the CCTV videos, etc. It can be really useful and helpful for a short frame of time. If you're not working for 3 or 4, 5 months, the videos can really be of a good help to you. Some of the tools are also more sophisticated when you are using Twitter, for example, and the tweet deck. And I know for me, for example, as a journalist writing and producing basically in Arabic, for us, it is much more complicated to use the sophisticated tools because we don't have much information in Arabic in the internet, which makes it really hard for us to get the same results when we are looking for it. But if you are using English or French or German or any other language, you can really dig deep into these kind of sophisticated tools that all the Twitter and the advanced research can help you with.
Thank you, Amal. Let's go to Daneel.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is going to be too rudimentary, but it certainly is my most valuable tool, and that's my phone. And just as I mentioned earlier, source development and a lot of conversations and a lot of networking with people that are inside the institutions. I know it seems intuitively difficult to develop relationships with whistleblowers, but I have been amazed at how poised people within the institutions, the oversight institutions, but also within the police service, and especially retirees within the police service in South Africa are willing to debate these things, to have robust conversations, to explain an insider's perspective. So for me, networking, communication with real human sources, and using my phone, obviously through encrypted means or burner phones when the conversations become slightly more sensitive, as they sometimes do. That's been my most important kind of tool, and I guess a conventional reporting technique, but one that shouldn't be underestimated because it's yielded incredible results for me in terms of my knowledge and investigation. Thank you.
Thank you. Haley, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with, really there's often no replacement for just speaking to people, but speaking to tools and the visual investigations context specifically, like there's always, I think people think, we use a lot of fancy technology that nobody understands, and people ask, how do I do this if I'm freelance? How do I do this if I'm not in a big newsroom? I had never worked in a newsroom before coming to the Times, and the best tools for open source research are free and publicly available and very easy to use. So for me, I would say Twitter and the Google Suite, like using Google Sheets and using Google Docs to organize all of the evidence that you're collecting. Sometimes that's, all you need. And there aren't that many barriers to doing this kind of research, as many barriers as I think people would expect.
Okay, thank you, and I'll give the last word to Malachy.
I would echo that, everything that everybody else has said, and the best tool is yourself and your phone, and organizing. For me, doing a lot of digital work, it's organizing your digital workstation, practicing with the different tools and reporting methods, and just having them readily available so you don't forget where they are, how to use them, and just organize them into a sort of a, as I say, a workstation. There's a great tool called start.me, and that's a sort of an advanced bookmarks organizer, and you can have different categories of bookmarks all on your display, and you can set it so that it's your new tab on Chrome. And that's what I do. And I have like all of my satellite imagery stuff, my Twitter search, YouTube search, people search, all of that into different folders. See if I can find it. I recently changed it. Yeah, let me just, can I share this really quickly? So if you look here, these are all the tools that I have for Twitter, YouTube, monitoring, other tools, metadata, satellite imagery, etc. It's a really, really useful tool.
Okay, thank you for that summary.
Thank you.
Now we received lots of questions. Just before I hand over to Hannane, let me just apologize to everybody whose questions we've not responded to, or asked and responded to. I think we'll use those to develop other resource guides that you'll see on the GIJN website. So please follow us, keep following us on the website and on the social media accounts. Back to you, Hannane.
Thank you so much, Benon, for this information and for moderating the Q&A. As you said, we've run out of time, but before we close, I would like to thank GIJN and our audience today for being with us. And a very big thank you, obviously, to our speakers for their presentations and being so generous with their knowledge and experience. Daneel, Amal, Haley, and Malachy, thank you for being with us. For those of you attending the Africa Investigative Journalism Conference and still with us now, we hope you can join us again on Tuesday, that's 27th of October at 9:30 EST or 3:30 in Johannesburg for a 2-hour online session on sustainability and independent journalism. Everyone, please also join GIJN and another great panel for the next global webinar. That is on Thursday, 29th of October. It will be at 2 p.m. EST, and the topic will be investigating autocracy. Once again, thank you all for being with us, and goodbye.